You sit at your desk, staring intently at a glowing screen, completely unaware that a silent, systemic emergency is unfolding within your upper thoracic cavity. Your shoulders have subtly rolled forward by less than 3 degrees, a microscopic shift that compresses the interscale triangle of your neck. Your breathing has shallowly retreated into the upper third of your lungs, causing the dome-shaped thoracic diaphragm to freeze mid-descent. Deep inside, your resting heart rate has crept upward to 82 beats per minute, driven by an invisible surge of norepinephrine circulating through your bloodstream. You do not feel acute pain, but rather a persistent, low-grade background hum of vigilance and settling internal friction that modern life tells you is entirely normal. This state of perpetual, low-threshold survival mode is not a moral failing, nor is it a symptom of psychological weakness. It is a predictable, mechanical consequence of an evolutionary mismatch, where an archaic nervous system engineered for the visual expansiveness of the Pleistocene savanna is forced to compress its entire sensory reality into a small, rectangle position 20 inches from the human face. The internet is saturated with superficial remedies for this modern malaise, offering transient escapes that completely ignore our underlying biological architecture. This is not another video telling you to drink warm lemon water, download an aesthetic meditation app, or submerge yourself in an ice bath to shock your system into compliance. Those practices treat the human body as an unpredictable black box, hoping an external stimulus will somehow rearrange the chaotic internal chemistry. To truly down-regulate a chronically alarmed physiology, we must look entirely beyond wellness trends and examine the hard, cold infrastructure of human anatomy. We must treat the body like a highly complex, engineered loop of neural circuitry, fluid dynamics, and biomechanical levers. The primary lever for this intervention is not a philosophical shift, but a physical one, rooted through a singular, colossal highway of the parasympathetic nervous system that modern survival habits have effectively throttled. This highway is the 10th cranial nerve, known anatomically as the vagus nerve, derived from the Latin word for wandering. It is the longest and most complex of the cranial nerves, originating in the paired nuclei of the medulla oblongata deep within the brainstem. From this ancient evolutionary control center, two thick bundles of myelinated and unmyelinated nerve fibers emerge, exiting the cranium through a narrow bony aperture known as the jugular foramen, situated directly between the occipital and temporal bones. The vagus nerve does not merely pass through the body. It weaves itself into the very fabric of our visceral existence, descending within the carotid sheath alongside the internal jugular vein and the common carotid artery. It splits into an intricate web of anterior and posterior trunks, sending dense arborizations to the pharynx, larynx, heart, lungs, and the entire expanse of the gastrointestinal tract, ending near the splenic flexure of the colon. Roughly 80% of the fibers within this massive neural cable are afferent, meaning they are constantly collecting sensory data from your internal organs and streaming it upward to the nucleus tractus solitarius in your brain. Your brain does not independently decide to feel anxious. It is told to feel anxious by the mechanical and chemical status of your viscera, communicated directly via this vagal highway. Under modern conditions, this delicate communication channel is subjected to constant physical and neurological interference. When you adopt a forward head posture to look at a mobile device or monitor, the occiput tilts backward, compressing the suboccipital space. This localized structural compression compromises the rectus capitis posterior major and minor muscles, which possess an extraordinarily high density of muscle spindles directly linked to the vestibular and visual tracking systems. As these suboccipital tissues tighten, they restrict the microcirculation surrounding the jugular foramen, exerting subtle but continuous mechanical pressure on the vagus nerve at its point of cranial exit. Simultaneously, the chronic restriction of the thoracic diaphragm eliminates the natural, rhythmic pressure changes that occur within the thoracic and abdominal cavities during deep ancestral respiration. In a healthy human system, every inhalation increases intra-abdominal pressure, compressing the inferior vena cava and forcing a bolus of blood toward the heart, which activates the cardiac baroreceptors. The vagus nerve senses this transient pressure spike and instantly releases acetylcholine at the sinoatrial node, slowing the heart rate during exhalation, a phenomenon known as respiratory sinusarrhythmia. When your breathing remains shallow, this mechanical feedback loop breaks down entirely, leaving the sympathetic accelerator permanently depressed. The consequences of this mechanical and neural throttling cascade down to the cellular level within minutes. Without the inhibitory, calming influence of vagal acetylcholine, the sinoatrial node fires unchecked, and the sympathetic chain ganglia along the thoracic spine dominate the autonomic landscape. This shifts the cellular environment into a pro-inflammatory state. Macrophages within the splenic and mesenteric circulation, no longer suppressed by the alpha-7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on their cell surfaces, begin synthesizing and secreting elevated levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, specifically tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-6. This low-grade inflammatory signaling alters the permeability of the blood-brain barrier and compromises the tight junctions of the gut endothelial lining, leading to a systemic state of hypervigilance. Your mitochondria, the metabolic powerhouses of your cells, detect this shift through altered baseline oxygen consumption rates, adjusting their adenosine triphosphate production toward short-term survival pathways rather than long-term cellular repair and maintenance. To reverse this systemic downward spiral, we do not require hours of isolation or complex therapeutic interventions. Because the nervous system operates on instant feedback loops governed by pressure, posture, and visual input, we can exploit specific anatomical vulnerabilities to force an immediate reset. By isolating the precise muscular and ocular mechanisms that intersect with the vagal pathway, we can send an unambiguous, hardwired signal to the brainstem that the immediate environment is completely secure. This protocol takes less than 60 seconds. Yet it relies on profound physiological laws: the oculocardiac reflex, the reciprocal inhibition of the suboccipital muscles, and the mechanical decompression of the jugular foramen. It requires no voluntary effort to calm down mentally. Instead, we manipulate the structural container of the body to make a state of anxiety biomechanically impossible. The primary anatomical portal for this immediate physiological intervention lies within the complex muscular architecture of the human orbit and its direct, hardwired connection to the brainstem. When you look at a digital screen, your eyes converge and your focus narrows onto a highly localized point, a visual state known as foveal vision. Evolutionarily, this tightly focused, high-acuity vision is reserved for tracking prey, assessing immediate physical threats, or managing acute crises. It is structurally linked to the sympathetic nervous system, triggering an involuntary increase in tonic alertness. Conversely, when our ancestors scanned the wide expanses of the Pleistocene landscapes, they utilized peripheral vision abroad and focused, panoramic awareness of the environment. Panoramic vision is neuroanatomically linked to the nuclei of the parasympathetic nervous system, signaling to the ancient brain structures that no immediate predator is present, thereby allowing the body to safely drop its defensive muscular guarding. By combining this panoramic visual shift with a targeted physical manipulation of the ocular muscles, we can trigger an ancient survival loop known as the oculocardiac reflex. This reflex is mediated by the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, or the fifth cranial nerve, which detects changes in pressure and position within the extraocular muscles. Specifically, when the medial and lateral rectus muscles of the eye are held in extreme lateral gazes, sensory signals are transmitted through the ciliary ganglion to the main sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. From there, interneurons cross over within the reticular formation to directly stimulate the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve. The response is instantaneous and purely mechanical. The vagus nerve fires a burst of parasympathetic signals down the vagal trunks, releasing acetylcholine directly onto the sinoatrial and atrioventricular nodes of the heart. This action binds to muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, specifically the M2 subtype, which hyperpolarizes the cardiac pacemaking cells by opening potassium channels, instantly dropping your heart rate and reducing systemic vascular resistance. To perform this mechanical reset, the body must first be placed in a position that minimizes all competing gravity-sensing reflexes. By lying flat on your back in a supine position, you neutralize the firing of the postural muscles along the spine and downregulate the activity of the vestibular system. Interlock your fingers and place both hands directly behind the back of your head, allowing the weight of your skull to rest fully in your palms. This specific hand placement supports the occiput, preventing any passive extension or hyperextension of the cervical spine. The goal here is to establish a pristine alignment where the suboccipital muscles, the rectus capitis posterior major, the rectus capitis posterior minor, the obliquus capitis superior, and the obliquus capitis inferior are entirely unloaded and relaxed. These tiny muscles have an astronomical density of mechanoreceptors, containing up to 36,000 muscle spindles per gram of tissue, compared to just 50 spindles per gram in larger muscles like the gluteus maximus. They act as the primary structural compass for your brain, constantly reporting the exact spatial orientation of your head. Once you are securely in position with your head resting heavily in your hands, keep your head completely still, facing dead center toward the ceiling. Without turning your skull even a fraction of a millimeter, move your eyes as far to the right as they can possibly go, attempting to look at your right elbow. This lateral shift forces the right lateral rectus muscle and the left medial rectus muscle into a state of maximum contraction, while stretching their opposing muscle partners. Hold this extreme rightward gaze continuously for 30 seconds. Within 15 to 30 seconds of maintaining this position, you will experience a highly distinct, involuntary autonomic sigh, a sudden deep inhalation, or a spontaneous swallow. This is not a psychological response. It is the physical manifestation of the oculocardiac reflex successfully overriding your sympathetic baseline. The involuntary sigh is a reset mechanism managed by the pre-Batzinger complex in the brainstem, which receives the incoming parasympathetic signals from the vagus nerve and commands the respiratory system to deeply expand the alveoli of the lungs. After experiencing this autonomic release on the right side, bring your eyes back to the dead center position for a brief pause of 2 or 3 slow and forced respiratory cycles. Then, keeping your skull perfectly stationary against your interlocked fingers, shift your eyes as far to the left as humanly possible, looking toward your left elbow. Hold this position with absolute steady consistency for another 30 seconds. Once again, as the trigeminal vagal loop completes its circuit, you will notice a second autonomic release, often accompanied by a distinct salivation response. Salivation occurs because the vagus nerve, along with the glossopharyngeal nerve, innervates the major salivary glands, and its activation immediately switches the digestive tract from a state of ischemic shutdown to a state of active secretion. By executing this simple 60-second sequence, you have physically altered the structural alignment of the upper cervical spine while utilizing the extraocular muscles to force the brainstem into a state of profound parasympathetic dominance. The profound efficacy of this protocol stems from its immediate effect on the suboccipital muscles through a biomechanical law known as reciprocal inhibition. When you glance intensely to one side, the brain simultaneously sends inhibitory signals to relax the suboccipital muscles on that same side, allowing the head to theoretically rotate smoothly. By forcing the eyes to move while mechanically locking the head in place with your hands, you isolate this inhibitory signaling. The tight, shortened suboccipital tissues that were previously compressing the jugular foramen are forced to release their tonic grip. This release instantly decompresses the microvascular environment surrounding the 10th cranial nerve as it exits the skull. The venous congestion within the jugular vein clears, the pressure drops, and the vagus nerve is freed from the mechanical entrapment that modern forward head postures enforce every single day. The physiological transformation initiated by this manual decompression extends far beyond the cervical spine, completely altering the mechanical behavior of the primary respiratory muscle, the thoracic diaphragm. Under chronic sympathetic stress, the diaphragm remains locked in a high, hyperinflated position, forcing the accessory breathing muscles, the scalenes, the sternocleidomastid, and the pectoralis minor to work overtime to pull air into the lungs. This upper chest breathing pattern maintains a high mechanical tension on the sympathetic chain ganglia that run vertically along the heads of your ribs. When the suboccipital tissues release and the vagal tone increases, the phrenic nerve, which rises from cervical segments C3 through C5, can finally command the diaphragm to undergo a full, uninhibited concentric contraction. As the diaphragm drops during a deep, vagally mediated inhalation, it acts as a massive physical piston, drastically reducing intrathoracic pressure while increasing intra-abdominal pressure. This rhythmic pressure oscillation between the thoracic and abdominal cavities is the primary engine driving your systemic fluid dynamics. When intrathoracic pressure drops, it creates a powerful vacuum effect that draws the oxygenated blood out of the inferior vena cava and into the right atrium of the heart. Simultaneously, the increased intra-abdominal pressure compresses the hepatic portal system and the mesenteric capillary beds, squeezing stagnant venous blood and lymphatic fluid back into the central circulation. This process is known as the respiratory pump. By restoring the full excursion of the diaphragm through the suboccipital reset, you are physically clearing vascular congestion throughout your internal organs. The vagus nerve senses this restored fluid movement via specialized mechanoreceptors embedded within the walls of the great vessels and the atrial chambers, reporting back to the brainstem that the body's internal plumbing is operating under optimal, low-resistance conditions. This fluid shift has an immediate, profound impact on the enteric nervous system. The vast network of over 100 million neurons embedded within the walls of the gastrointestinal tract. Under a sympathetic state, blood flow is shunted away from the viscera and toward the skeletal muscles to prepare for defensive action, a state of localized ischemia that impairs motility and halts the secretion of protective mucosal barriers. When the vagus nerve fires, it releases acetylcholine onto the myenteric and submucosal plexuses of the gut wall. This neurochemical signal binds to muscarinic receptors, instantly stimulating peristalsis, the coordinated, wave-like contractions of smooth muscle that move food through the digestive tract. It also triggers the release of digestive enzymes, hydrochloric acid, and protective bicarbonate ions, while simultaneously tightening the tight junctions between epithelial cells, effectively sealing the gut barrier against circulating endotoxins. On a microscopic scale, this systemic shift from defensive hypervigilance to visceral recovery alters the genetic expression of your immune cells. When circulating macrophages and dendritic cells are continuously exposed to high levels of norepinephrine from sympathetic nerve endings, their intracellular signaling pathways prioritize the transcription of pro-inflammatory genes via the nuclear factor capillite chain enhancer of activated B cells, or an FKB pathway. However, when vagal acetylcholine binds to the alpha-7 nicotinic receptors on these same immune cells, it activates a specialized intracellular cascade known as the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. This pathway suppresses the phosphorylation of the STAT3 transcription factor and blocks the release of inflammatory cytokines. Within minutes of a successful vagal reset, the systemic production of molecular alarms drops, allowing your immune system to transition away from indiscriminate, low-grade tissue destruction and toward targeted, high-fidelity cellular repair. To sustain this optimized physiological state over a lifetime, we must look beyond acute interventions and systematically redesign how our physical structures interact with our modern environment. The human body is a highly adaptive, living matrix that molds itself directly to the shapes we force it to hold for hours at a time. If you spend 8 hours a day with your gaze locked onto a fixed, narrow plane while your upper cervical spine is compressed, no single 60-second protocol can completely undo that structural adaptation. We must integrate these ancestral biomechanical principles into our daily workflow, turning our environment into a passive driver of parasympathetic tone rather than a constant source of sympathetic effort. Action. This requires a deliberate restructuring of our visual habits, our seated ergonomics, and our unconscious respiratory mechanics. The first and most critical adjustment is the intentional integration of the panoramic visual reset throughout your working hours. Every 45 minutes of focused, close-up foveal vision must be counterbalanced by a deliberate 60-second transition into peripheral expansion. Step away from the screen, look out a window toward the most distant horizon available, and consciously soften your eyes. Allow your awareness to expand outward to the extreme edges of your left and right fields of vision, tracking the subtle movements of objects in your periphery without moving your head or focusing on a nice single point. This simple behavioral habit exploits the exact same neuroanatomical pathways as the supine eye gaze protocol, breaking the cycle of sympathetic accumulation before it can trigger the suboccipital guarding reflex and the subsequent mechanical throttling of the 10th cranial nerve. Simultaneously, we must eliminate the mechanical compression of the jugular foramen by altering our physical relationship with gravity. Ensure that your primary workspace allows your cranium to balance effortlessly atop the atlas vertebra, the first cervical unit of your spine. Position your monitors so that the top third of the screen sits directly at eye level. allowing the eyes to maintain a neutral or slightly downward gaze without requiring an extension of the upper cervical spine or a collapse of the lower cervical lordosis. When the skull is balanced properly, the suboccipital muscles require minimal tonic contraction to keep your head upright, ensuring that the microvascular pathways surrounding the vagus nerve remain entirely open, uncompressed, and free from structural entrapment throughout the day. Finally, we must recognize that the ultimate metric of a resilient nervous system is heart rate variability, the microscopic variation in time intervals between consecutive heartbeats. A high heart rate variability indicates a highly adaptive autonomic nervous system that can transition seamlessly between defensive alertness and deep, restorative calm. By freeing the vagus nerve from its mechanical shackles and restoring the full, rhythmic excursion of the thoracic diaphragm, you are directly training this autonomic flexibility. You are transitioning your body away from an artificial, modern state of low-grade survival mode and returning it to its ancestral baseline, a state where the mind remains sharply focused, the physical structures remain completely relaxed, and the internal organs operate under the quiet, efficient, and undisputed dominance of the parasympathetic nervous system.